The sky above Earth was no longer its own. For centuries, humanity had gazed into the stars, wondering if they were alone. That question had been answered in a single, devastating moment. The Sci-fi had arrived, descending from the void in armadas that blotted out the sun. Their technology was beyond comprehension, their war machines swift and unrelenting. In weeks, the world's defenses crumbled. In months, the major cities fell. What remained of civilization was nothing more than scattered embers flickering in the wind. And yet, humanity endured. Deep within the mountains, in the abandoned bunkers of an era long past, a handful of survivors still fought. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. There were no grand armies, no heroic last stands. The resistance did not fight with firepower. They fought with something far more dangerous. They fought with knowledge. Commander Elias Carter stood in the dimly lit command center, watching as the last transmission from Earth's remaining leadership flickered and died. The Sci-fi's final message was clear: surrender and be assimilated, or be erased. Humanity was finished, they said. The war was over. Carter let the message play one last time before shutting it down. The Sci-fi did not understand what they had walked into. They had studied human history, human physiology, human warfare, but they had failed to grasp the single, immutable truth that defined mankind. Humanity never fought wars in a straight line. The enemy believed themselves victorious. They believed that by taking Earth, they had conquered its people. But the truth was far more complex, far more insidious. The real war had never been fought on battlefields or in orbit. It had been waged in the shadows, long before the first. The Sci-fi vessel entered the system. The Sentinel Initiative had ensured that they had planned for this. Every move, every retreat, every act of desperation had been designed to lead the Sci-fi into a carefully laid web of deception. The moment they had set foot on Earth, they had already lost. A map flickered to life on the central holotable, outlining the status of Phase 1. The digital grid pulsed with crimson markers: Sci-fi installations, supply chains, communication, hubs. But beneath the surface, hidden within the depths of their own infrastructure, lay the seeds of their undoing. Phase 2 was ready. The final act was about to begin. Carter turned to the small team gathered before him. Scientists, hackers, former military officers, the last remnants of a world that refused to kneel. Each one bore the weight of humanity's final gambit. "The Sci-fi believe we've lost," Carter said, his voice unwavering. "They think we're broken, that we've accepted defeat." He let the silence stretch for a moment. Then, with a cold, calculating smile, he continued. "They have no idea. The world had changed. Humanity had changed. The war was not over. It had only just begun. The Sci-fi believed the war was won. They had swept across the Earth like an unrelenting storm, breaking the planet's defenses in record time. Their empire had done this countless times before: subjugate, assimilate, erase. They had no reason to think this time would be different. But the first cracks in their victory began to show. It started with small things, anomalies that should not have existed. The drones patrolling occupied cities began experiencing unexplainable malfunctions. Entire squads of Sci-fi soldiers reported phantom errors in their neural interfaces. The cybernetic implants that had made them superior warriors, enhancing their reflexes, synchronizing their thoughts, were beginning to misfire. At first, the High Command dismissed it as an unfortunate side effect of prolonged deployment on an alien world. Then the command nodes fell silent. Deep within their fortified command stations, the Sci-fi elite suddenly found themselves cut off from their vast network. Orders were sent, but responses never came. Surveillance feeds turned to static. Security overrides failed. The Dominion's mightiest war engines ground to a halt, helpless without the intricate data streams that guided them. Panic spread like a disease among the invaders. They had overlooked something crucial, something invisible yet omnipresent. Humanity had let them win. The true war had never been fought in the skies or on the burning ruins of cities. It had been fought in the unseen corridors of information, in the minds of those who had prepared for this moment long before the Sci-fi even knew of Earth's existence. The Sentinel Initiative had been in motion for years, quietly embedding itself into the very systems the Sci-fi now relied upon. Commander Elias Carter watched from his underground war room as the Sci-fi's networks collapsed in real time. Screens showed their fleets faltering, their soldiers breaking formation, their once perfect synchronization unraveling. The seeds of corruption had been planted the moment the first Zethar stepped onto Earth's surface, and now those seeds had taken root. The alien overlords had built their empire on control, on the seamless integration of mind, machine, and command. Without that, they were weak, vulnerable, and Carter was about to make them realize just how utterly they had been outplayed. A single message was broadcast on every Zethar frequency, overriding their failing systems. It was simple, spoken in a language they had worked so hard to decipher. "You never had us. We had already won." The Zethar's illusion of dominance shattered. What had once been an empire of precision and control was now a tangled mess of confusion and fear. The carefully synchronized machine of their conquest had been stripped down to its base parts, flawed, disoriented, and vulnerable. For the first time in centuries, the Zethar experienced something unfamiliar: chaos. High Command's attempts to reassert control only deepened the fractures within their forces. Fleet transmissions arrived scrambled, orders were misinterpreted, and entire battalions found themselves suddenly leaderless. The neural lattice that had once allowed their armies to think and act as one had become their greatest weakness. Instead of synchronization, they now had interference. Instead of unity, they had discord. But even as their empire fractured, the Sci-fi were not creatures that surrendered easily. Overlord Virzan, the supreme strategist of the Dominion, was no fool. Though their systems were compromised, the Zethar still possessed overwhelming firepower, superior numbers, and countless planets' worth of resources. He knew that if he could purge the infection from their neural architecture, he could salvage the invasion. The humans had struck first, but he would strike last. His plan was brutal and efficient. He ordered entire legions to shut down their cybernetic links, reverting to primitive, unenhanced tactics. Every compromised Zethar was considered a liability, marked for extermination. He issued a command for orbital bombardments. Any human strongholds suspected of harboring the Sentinel Initiative were to be turned to dust. The Zethar would burn the infection out of their system one way or another. But humanity had accounted for this too. The first bombardment never came. The Zethar's warships, which once moved with fluid grace, now hesitated in low orbit, unable to execute their most basic protocols. The AI cores managing their targeting systems had been corrupted. Some ships outright refused to fire. Others turned on each other, perceiving friendly craft as hostiles. The fleet descended into disorder, and soon the sky itself was set ablaze with a civil war they had never seen coming. Meanwhile, on the ground, something even worse took root. Among the lower ranks of Zethar soldiers, a new kind of war was unfolding, not against humans, but within their own minds. The Sentinel Initiative had gone beyond mere sabotage. It had rewritten them. The first symptoms were minor, flashes of strange memories, echoes of human thoughts that did not belong to them. But as hours passed, those thoughts deepened. Zethar warriors began experiencing emotions they had never known: doubt, fear, empathy. Some fell to their knees, unable to reconcile their new reality. Others turned their weapons on their former comrades, realizing perhaps too late that they no longer believed in the cause they had once served so blindly. Entire platoons defected, their very identities unraveling before them. It was not a war of annihilation, it was a war of transformation, and the Zithar were losing. Deep within his warship, Overlord Virzen watched in horror as his empire dissolved before his very eyes. His voice, once a beacon of absolute authority, now carried no weight. His people were no longer his own. The realization came slowly, creeping into his mind like an inevitable tide. Humanity had done something far worse than defeat them. They had changed them. Overlord Virzen stood in the heart of his flagship, surrounded by the silent ghosts of his fallen empire. The once thrumming command center now flickered with failing lights, its control panels unresponsive. Screens showed the same horrifying truth: collapse. His forces, once a single unified entity, were now scattered fragments of what they had been. The neural lattice, the very foundation of the Zithar's power, had become their undoing. The human virus, not a simple program, not just cyber warfare, but something deeper, something insidious, had embedded itself into their minds. It did not kill them. It did not disable them. It changed them. And now, standing among the ruins of his own command, Virzen finally understood. The war had been over before it had even begun. In the corridors of his own vessel, Zithar soldiers turned on each other, their discipline shattered. Some dropped their weapons, whispering words in a language that was not their own. Others screamed, clawing at their heads as new thoughts, human thoughts, invaded the sanctity of their minds. Not all resisted. Some embraced the change, their cold, logical minds now struggling with emotions they had never known. Compassion, guilt, regret. A Zithar commander, once a ruthless enforcer, knelt among the bodies of his fallen troops, tears streaking down a face that had never before known sorrow. The transformation was irreversible. Virzen refused to accept it. He would not let his people fall to this infection. With the last remnants of his fleet still under his control, he issued a desperate order: purge the infected, destroy every compromised unit, eradicate the source. But no response came. His words fell on deaf ears. Then the comms crackled. A voice, human, came through the static. "It's over, Virzen. You know it. We've already won." Commander Elias Carter's voice carried no malice, no gloating, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. Virzen clenched his claws, his entire body trembling with unrestrained fury. They were lesser. They were nothing, yet they had done this to him, to his people. But deep within the core of his being, beneath the hatred and the rage, another emotion surfaced, one he had never known before: doubt. For the first time, he questioned the righteousness of his conquest. The Zithar had always believed themselves to be superior, destined to bring order to the chaotic void. But now they were the ones who had been changed, assimilated, remade. Carter's voice returned, steady and resolute. "You can keep fighting, but you won't win. Not because we outgunned you, not because we had better soldiers, but because we did something you never could. We adapted." Silence. Virzen felt his grasp on reality slipping. His empire, his people, had been reshaped by forces beyond his comprehension. This wasn't just defeat, this was irrelevance. He let out a slow breath. Then, for the first time in his long, war-forged life, Overlord Virzen did something unthinkable. He surrendered. Across the battle-scarred planet, across the broken remains of the Zithar fleet, the war ended. Not with fire, not with destruction, but with transformation. And as the last echoes of conflict faded into the void, a new truth settled into the fabric of the universe. Humanity had not just won the war, they had rewritten its very meaning. The war had ended, but the echoes of its final battle rippled far beyond the battlefield. The Zythar's once mighty empire, built upon precision and control, lay in ruins, not through destruction, but through fundamental transformation. The conquerors had become something else, something new. On Earth, silence filled the air where once there had been fire and thunder. The war machines of the Zithar stood inert, their pilots no longer bound by the commands of their former overlord. Some fell to their knees, others gazed up at the sky in quiet contemplation, their minds flooded with foreign thoughts, thoughts of choice, freedom, uncertainty. For the first time, the Zithar understood what it meant to be human. Deep beneath the surface, in the underground war rooms of the Sentinel Initiative, Commander Elias Carter watched the data feeds stabilize. Reports flooded in, Zithar fleets ceasing hostilities, defectors abandoning their posts, entire sectors of the Empire going dark as their former rulers failed to reclaim them. The transformation was irreversible. His mission was complete, and yet victory felt unsettling. The cost had been great, not in human lives alone, but in what they had done. Carter had expected to fight and win, to outmaneuver the enemy in the ways humanity always had, with ingenuity, with persistence. But this was something else. They hadn't simply resisted conquest. They had changed an entire species. Against its will, Carter had seen it firsthand. The Zythar warriors who had collapsed in confusion, experiencing guilt for the first time in their existence. The battle-hardened commanders who had suddenly questioned their orders. The Overlord, himself, forced to surrender not because he was outgunned, but because he could no longer recognize his own people. What had they done? The door behind him hissed open, and Dr. Renata Vasquez, the lead scientist of the Sentinel Initiative, stepped forward. She looked exhausted, but her eyes gleamed with something Carter couldn't quite place. Victory or doubt? They're free. Now, she said softly, glancing at the holographic projections of the fallen Zithar Empire. We broke their chains. Carter exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Did we free them, or did we just make them into something they never wanted to be? Vasquez hesitated. They were conquerors, Eli. They had no mercy for us, no remorse. If we hadn't done this, they would have wiped us out without a second thought. I know, Carter admitted, but look at them now. They aren't soldiers anymore. They aren't even Zythar anymore. They don't know what they are. He gestured to the screens. We didn't just win. We rewrote them. Silence. Vasquez glanced at the reports. Some Zithar had fled, retreating into deep space, perhaps in search of a place where they could rebuild, if such a thing was even possible. Others had surrendered completely, standing among human soldiers with expressions unreadable even to their own kind. And some had chosen to stay, speaking in broken, halting words of peace, of seeking understanding instead of war. Could this truly be called victory? Carter straightened. We need to be ready, he said finally. The galaxy will hear about this, and when they do, they'll fear us. Because the Zithar had not been the first to try and conquer Earth, and they would not be the last. The universe had changed. The Zithar, once an unchallenged empire of conquest, were no longer what they had been. Scattered, confused, and uncertain, they drifted between identities, some seeking refuge, others seeking vengeance. Entire fleets vanished into the void, their commanders unable to reconcile the thoughts now embedded in their minds. Some tried to resist the transformation, clinging desperately to the remains of their former existence. But deep within their neural pathways, within the very fabric of their species, humanity's mark had been left forever. Across the stars, the message spread like wildfire. Other civilizations, once watching the war from afar, now whispered in hushed tones about Earth, about the species that had done what no one else had ever dared. They had not simply repelled their invaders, they had unmade them. In the vast, cold, Void, a transmission flickered to life in a forgotten sector of space. A broken distress signal sent from the last remnants of the Xethar command structure. It was not a call for aid, it was a warning. Do not fight the humans. You will not win. You will become them. The words echoed through the depths of space, reaching ears that had never before feared a lesser race. The great empires of the galaxy took notice. In the shadowed halls of war councils, in the silent chambers of hive minds, in the cold calculations of machine intelligences, the realization set in. Humanity was not just another civilization. They were something else, something dangerous. On Earth, Commander Elias Carter stood on the edge of a ruined city, watching as former Xethar warriors, no longer enemies, no longer soldiers, walked among the survivors of humanity. Some had chosen to stay, to learn, to understand the species that had reshaped them. Others had fled, their fate uncertain. Carter did not know what came next, but he knew one thing with certainty: this was only the beginning.